Because I said so, that's why. Kids growing up now ask more questions. That's good. I want my girls to have more than just inquisitive minds. I want them to be more aware. I want them to question why people do the things that they do. I want them to question why they do or do not say the things that they do. And most importantly, I want them to be on a lifelong journey seeking the truth in this world. Never in my lifetime has that been more important. What do we do when we come here on Sunday morning? We invite the Holy Spirit in our midst. We come here to seek the truth, to be exposed to the truth. And if we claim to honestly be seeking the truth, then it requires good questions. We want our kids to grow up in an educational atmosphere at our church where they ask good questions and we try to give good answers. It's not always easy. I'll never forget meeting a man my dad invited to speak at our church. He was formerly a professor at Southern Seminary. His name was Dr. Ralph Elliott. And back in the 1960s, he wrote a book about Genesis that not only included the fact that the name Adam in Hebrew is translated as mankind or humankind in English, but it was also his opinion that Adam or Adam was not likely one person, but the writer's way of describing the beginning of mankind. Now, the reaction to the book in Baptist life at the time was as if this man had blasphemed in the worst way. He was a highly respected scholar. But because of that book, he lost his job at the seminary, and it put all kinds of stress on his family, but he eventually landed in an American Baptist church up in Chicago. So, of course, when Dad invited him to come speak at our church, I remember Dad rolling out the red carpet for him. That was my first memory of seeing how seriously our church takes the concept of hospitality. But the controversy was over nothing more than just posing the question, was Adam a person? Now, to me, I tend to think that he was, but I am neither offended or even challenged by someone who believes otherwise. Why? Because the truth behind the story is so much more important than whether or not he was one human being. Now, anybody that has taught fifth grade Sunday school knows what these questions sound like. It goes like this. God made Adam and Eve. They had two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel, but eventually Cain got married. To whom? So here's what it used to sound like back in the day. The kid in fifth grade Sunday school would ask, and where did she come from? And the answer would be, stop asking so many questions. I can imagine how my grandfather would handle that question. Where did Cain's wife come from? Go clean the barn. Well, I can tell you that I've been so impressed with my kids' education from the very beginning. They learned about different kinds of literature way before I did growing up. They were taught about imagery and metaphor and poetry, reading between the lines, all of which are in the stories in the Bible. How sad is it to be on a quest for the truth in the Bible and leave all those ways of pointing to the truth at the front door of the church before you come in on Sunday morning? Are we not supposed to use every part of our education when we come to church? I remember teaching high school and trying to teach the kids how to read between the lines, which was hard to do because they didn't even want to read all the lines. They wanted to be given the answers. And you remember what that was like. They would read the question. They wouldn't read the material. They'd go straight to the question, and then they scanned the material for the key words so they could get it over with. Not a good way to learn history. So I'm up here trying to tell them that in order to read between the lines, you have to read all the lines. And they would honestly act like they didn't know what I was talking about. And of course, I knew that they did. But I eventually came up with something that was fun that proved that they knew what I was talking about, and they really enjoyed this activity every year. I would have them write and read out loud to the class a Dear John letter. Because you know what a breakup letter sounds like. It says everything besides the dead truth. I don't ever want to see your face again. And then they got that, and some of their stories were just hilarious. So we spent time having fun learning how to read these stories. In this case, stories about history, but stories nonetheless. And with good stories, regardless of what kind, the power of the story is not so obvious in the beginning. And there is more depth and richness in the story when things are not obvious. This morning, I want to share a story with you from back when I was in the seminary of how a familiar story just took on powerful meaning by nothing more than just reading between the lines. I had this buddy of McAfee. His name was Jim. And Jim was the total opposite of me. He loved diving into the Greek and Hebrew, the kind of stuff that just bore me to tears, until one day, Jim was so into this stuff that he took an advanced Hebrew class at another seminary in Atlanta that was made up of primarily older Jewish men who had been studying Hebrew their whole lives. So basically, this class was studying the Old Testament from a Jewish scholar perspective, something that no Baptist has probably ever done. But anyway, Jim and I start talking about this class he was taking one day, and he tells me this story that was just so powerful to me. I had never considered this in this way. It was the story we all learned in 5th grade Sunday school, the story of Abraham and Isaac, where God commands Abraham to take his son Isaac up on the mountain to the altar and ultimately to use Isaac as the sacrifice for God. And you remember how the story was told to us as children. At the last moment, God provides a ram caught in a thicket to serve as the sacrifice, and God commands Abraham to take Isaac off the altar, and he is saved. But in this class that my friend Jim took with these old Jewish men, one of the men pointed out that the rules for how the altar was built and how the sacrifice was to take place, those rules were very specific and very strict. And he pointed out that one of those rules was that before the sacrifice could be placed on the altar, the fire must be lit first. Which meant that before Isaac was saved, Abraham must have been standing there smelling the flesh of his son burning before God intervened. Now that is a powerful part of that story that requires reading between the lines in order to fully understand it. And maybe Baptists have been more guilty of missing out on this kind of context more than any others because they refuse to consider the perspective of another. The Bible contains truth in all kinds of forms: imagery, proverbs, poetry, symbolism, psalms, parables, narratives. And how sad is it if we as Christians are supposed to be on a lifelong search for the truth, but in our spiritual lives, we revert to the level of a teenager and just want the answers given to us. And there are those opportunities. The 10 Commandments are an example. Here are 10 good rules to live by. But remember, we as Christians believe that Jesus came because the rules were not enough. And the questions are too big and too important to be answered easily. It takes effort. It takes study. It takes experience in life. that leads you to understand the power of these stories. They are earthly images of heavenly realities. So the first rule, we might say, for interpreting the Bible is that God uses every imaginable form in relating the truth to us, and it is a lifelong pursuit that includes great mystery. This Old Testament passage that we read this morning is a powerful story. It is the prophet Nathan not just confronting King David, but the prophet confronting the hero of the Hebrew people at the height of his power and in the heyday of their history. So here's King David being confronted by a prophet who he trusts completely, and of all the ways he could have chosen to confront the king, this wise old prophet recognizes the power of a story, the power that it can have. So he tells David a story. He tells David there are two men in his kingdom. One was really rich and had many flocks and herds. The other man was very poor and only had one sheep, and this sheep was a part of his family. Did you catch that part of the verse? It says this sheep was like a daughter to him. I think that must have been the hook for David when he was hearing this story. So the rich man has a traveler come to him. And if you know anything about the Hebrew culture, hospitality was very important to them for good reason. So David understands that the rich man was compelled to provide for this stranger, but he didn't want to take from his own flock, so he took the poor man's sheep and he killed it and prepared it for the guest. And as David hears these words, he is angered, and not just a little. He says to Nathan, "As the Lord lives," this is righteous anger, "as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die because of what he has done and because he has no pity." Then Nathan says to David and to us some of the heaviest words in all of the Old Testament. Nathan, in effect, holds up a mirror and says to him, "David, you are the man." And David is changed by this from the inside out. Let me ask you a question this morning. Would it have been more effective? Would it have been as effective if Nathan had thrown down his Bible in front of him and began to shout out some of the 10 Commandments? "David, thou shalt not commit adultery. David, thou shalt not kill." Do you think it would have had the same effect on David? What we see in this passage is the power of stories. Before God gave us the 10 Commandments, He gave us stories. Why? Because they are so powerful and they're so effective. Have you ever thought about this? Jesus had about 3 years of ministry. He could have spent 3 years writing a really long list of do's and don'ts. And I think there's a lot of Christians in this world, if they were honest, wish that He had. People want answers given to them. Instead, Jesus chose parables, stories, images, symbols, and it made an incredible impact on the people that came to Him. One of my mentors believed that this passage that we read about David and the prophet Nathan had such an impact on Jesus that it was the origin of the reason that Jesus chose to teach in parables. Isn't that interesting? That it was the power of story that caused Jesus to choose to teach how to relate to God and to God's truth. I know this has happened to me many times. I'll bet it's happened to you. You come back to a story that Jesus used, that you heard many times as a young person, but you hear it with fresh ears as an adult, and it takes on brand new meaning to you. It's deeper now. This decision that Jesus made to teach this way is critical because we are relational as human beings. It's our relationships with each other and with the living Christ that gives us deeper meaning in life. It makes all the difference in the world. Because sometimes we get caught up in things that can keep the truth from being revealed or from giving us meaning. We get caught up in the wrong thing. Let me give you an example. I'm very fortunate to have many Bibles. I have my grandmother's Bible, I have my grandfather's Bible, and I have at least one of my dad's old Bibles. And several years ago, I was preparing to preach on the story of the woman caught in adultery, and for whatever reason, I picked up one of my dad's old Bibles, and I turned to John chapter 8, and the story was not there. And I thought, well, that is so odd. But if you check your Bible, you will see a footnote there. And it will say something like this: the most ancient authorities, meaning the oldest manuscripts of the Gospel of John, the most ancient authorities lack John 7, verse 53, which is the last verse in chapter 7, all the way through 8, verse 11, which is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Should I use that story? That story of Jesus and how he handles this woman caught in adultery, that story was so powerful. And it is so reflective of the life of Jesus. What do we have to gain by arguing whether or not it should be included in our Bible? Here is a story in the life of Jesus where he has turned the religious establishment upside down, so much so that they try to set him up, and they bring to him this woman caught in the very act of adultery. And they in effect say to him, the rules say, the Bible says, that this woman is to be stoned. What do you say, Jesus? And Jesus, in effect, holds up a mirror to them and says, you're right. But let the man who is without sin cast the first stone. Most of us probably never heard that story is not in the oldest manuscripts. Why? Because the truth behind that story is so powerful and infinitely more important than whether or not it was in the oldest manuscripts. The author of Genesis answers some incredibly deep questions using the power of story. Where did this world come from? The story of creation. Who am I? The story of people being made in the image of God. What is wrong with this world? The story of sin being introduced to the world. Why do people hate each other? The story of Cain and Abel. These stories are more than just historical events. They are intended to give us insight into our lives, and they are powerful in that way. I'll never forget hearing for the first time Dr. Claypool paraphrasing the creation story in his own words. He said, God found his own aliveness so incredibly joyful that he simply could not keep it to himself. And he made you, and he made me to relate to each other and to relate to him in this way. To take the love that he so freely gives to us and to give it to each other and to the people that God would place in our path. Most of you know that I didn't go into ministry until I was 36. I tell people that I lived a normal life up until then, and we'll just keep it at that. But I must not have been too bad, because when I turned 30, I became a deacon in our church. And this is years after my dad had passed away, but it also coincided with the death of my only uncle, Dad's only brother. He died up in Chicago, and his wife, my aunt, happens to be Catholic. And Uncle Ray had only one dying wish, and that was that he not be buried by a Catholic priest. So I'm standing in my kitchen, and we're preparing to go up to Chicago, and my aunt calls and says something like this: I understand that you just got ordained as a deacon at your church. Why don't you officiate the service. And I dropped 5 pounds in my kitchen right then. Best diet I've ever been on. Some of you may have heard me tell this story before, but here's the part that you have not heard me say. The person that I called to help us do the service was Ralph Elliott, that man who I had heard preach all those years before, and he was so kind to me. He had retired and moved away from Chicago, so he arranged for the current pastor of his former church to officiate, and it was wonderful. Not long after that, I was asked to speak at Kim's grandmother's funeral, and then at my mom's second husband's funeral, and all of this coincided with me teaching an adult Sunday school class for the first time at our church. It's what is now the Journey class. And the difference between teaching adult Sunday school class and what I was doing before, was teaching to children, is that now I was telling my own story of my walk with God. And that, in part, led me to being called into ministry and standing before you this morning. It is the power that is associated with stories. It changed my life. The Bible is not just some kind of self-help book. It is a book filled with all kinds of ways that help us connect, that ultimately leads to a relationship. This New Testament passage that we read, Jesus says, "Abide in me, and I will abide in you." And in effect, he is saying, if you will do that, you will have God's kind of joy. The kind of joy points the way to love. And Paul is clear, without love, everything else is just not worth having. The last verse that we read this morning says it this way: I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Before we leave this morning, I want to share something with you. It is such an incredible story. If you have heard me preach more than a few times, you know that I have a fascination with near-death experiences. It's a hobby of mine to read these accounts that people have. And I have read hundreds of these experiences. But this past week, I came across one from this man who is a professor of religion, and he didn't have just one near-death experience, he had 2. He almost died twice. One was on the day of his son's baptism, and a year later, he was on a trip to India. And ironically, both of these were the freak reaction to being bit by fire ants that caused him to have heart attacks. Each of his accounts were extensive. It would take another sermon for me to cover all of it, but many times people report feeling as if they are in a great body of water, and in this instance, he did both times. But I have never heard a description like this. My title for his experience, I would call Veils of Love. This is what he said. When I died, I was able to ascend the onrushing waterfall like some newly ethereal being freed of a heavy load, who is then able to flit up to the most finely wrought and perfectly balanced, beautiful mobile which had been hung from the heavens themselves, and I did so without disturbing the perfect balance of each lovely piece. I peacefully floated there, but after all too short a time, I was called to return to my flesh. I was able to perceive the light of the love of my children. It was more than vision, though I saw it. It was more than outside me, it was also within me. It was more than embracing of it, it was an immersion back into it. This love amplified me, energized me, revived me, and helped me to take breaths once again in my body, sent as I was back to this world. Curiously enough, This light was expansive, immersive, boundless, and limitless, but I felt it becoming more pointed and more singular, even as I gradually became aware that I, the bodily me, was staring in the ceiling of the swaying ambulance, which I was being transported. It was a gradual coming to, and as I re-entered my body and took breaths again, I was aware that I was sobbing. I was sobbing tears of pure ecstasy and joy and love. These were the tears of someone who has gone on a long, long journey and finally returned home to those he loves, realizing that they are the very reason for and purpose of his existence. I would like to think that these tears were a little trace of the cosmic ocean of love running down my face in this world, and a small but powerful sign of God's grace for us given as the gift of life with those we love. Not a drop in the ocean, but the entire ocean in a drop. Then in his second experience, he said, as the same tunnel closed in all about me and my conscious mind flew to pieces once more, I felt far less terror and far more tranquility than before. My old friend Death was coming to pay a visit. My heart beat out of my chest once again and my eyes filled with blood. My Indian friend kept vigil over me as I plunged under, and I knew that I was in good hands. Peace washed over me yet again. How can death be a return home? It is, or it was for me the second time. That same inky night abyss of an ocean with the same vault of brilliant stars above buoyed me within her adoring arms again. God welcomes home best of all, doesn't he? Such is love. Those same lights were all about me, caressing me. They were intimate again, like before, as if inside my heart. Perhaps that is why my heart beats so boldly from time to time. It may kill me one day, but I would have it no other way. That is how we are most real, after all, when we are in love. Think about those two small words, in love. We are in it. Despite our muddy encasements and wispy veils of this world, we just forget we have it backwards, actually. We think that the deepest oceanic love is in this world and that death severs us. Not so. We are in love all along. That is the really real, the categorically different sense of what is foundational to existence as experienced in a near-death experience. This world is wondrous, and I love all in it, especially my kids. They are the very how that I am in the first place. Laying there dying in the tea room of my Indian friend's house, I felt just as near to my children, even as I was 9,000 miles away from home. We are in the divine ocean of love already. Death teaches that. It is barely a nudge from here to there, but it is also a short trek back here. Death drops in seconds. It is with us all along, too. After a couple hours of lapsing in and out of consciousness, I eventually got back to the United States, to the waiting arms of my loving children once again. The veils wisp about and we think we are separated at death, but we can almost touch heaven in the meantime. We can almost dive in. The ocean awaits and it is gorgeous. We all have to die at some point, even Father Abraham and the mystics and the poets and even obtuse old Bible scholars. I will go there again one day, and I will go willingly without fear. Death is a friend now. I will go forth in my ending hours soaked in love, children and family and friends in my heart, whether in acts of love by our own hands like the baptism of a beautiful child, or immersion into divine love like a healing grave complex in India, it is all the same and all from God. The same ocean of love underlies all that is. It is all just life, death, and the veils of love. In our church, we have given many kinds of invitations over the years. And not long ago, we decided to just give people an invitation to be a part of kindness in this world and not of all the ugliness that we see so much. So our invitation to kindness to you today is to join us for our fellowship meal, our Valentine's banquet. Don't worry if you don't have an RSVP. Our members are going to let our guests go first. Everything will be just fine. If you can't make it, then our invitation to kindness is that when your husband claims that he needs to run to the store for something later on, let him go and act like you don't know what he's doing. Our hymn is number 607, Close to Thee. What a perfect hymn to sing at a time like this. Will you stand? Will you sing? Will you respond? We remain standing for just a moment. It's been such a good day, and it is not over. I hope you felt God's presence this morning. If you felt the Holy Spirit's presence this morning, tell somebody about it. Bring them back with you. Invite them to worship with us online. Why in the world would we keep this to ourselves? So will you join with me now in our open-eyed benediction? As you go out into the world, take the love of God with you, and as you go, remember there is nothing that you can do to make God love you anymore. There is nothing that you can do to make God love you any less. Let's learn to love each other this way.